Snow fell like ash over the town of Mercy Creek. It clung to rooftops and wagons, softened the dirt road that once knew blood, and caught in the frayed ropes swaying above the scaffold. The gallows had been built at midnight, boards slapped together by cold men who didn't speak, who looked away from the cell windows even when they knew she was watching. No one liked to meet the eyes of the condemned. She sat on the jail cot with her back straight, hands folded in her lap, wrists still raw from the ride-in. The iron bars held her, but it was the silence that sealed her fate. She hadn't spoken since they dragged her from the cabin, a woman alone, blood on her hem, hair loose like a madwoman, and no alibi that would soothe the preacher or the mayor or the sheriff who trembled under the town's stare. A woman like her wasn't expected to explain herself. She was expected to pay. The sheriff had asked once the day she was brought in. Sat across from her with his hat in his hands, called her by name, Jean, and tried to sound gentle. She just looked at him, slow and solemn, and said nothing. Not a tear, not a word. Just that tired, faraway gaze, like she was already swinging from the rope in her mind. That was 5 days ago. Now the sun hadn't risen yet, but the square was already gathering. Folk huddled in shawls and scuffed boots, murmuring through wool scarves, pretending this was justice and not a ritual soaked in something colder than law. Children stood on barrels, their eyes too wide. The preacher stood by the scaffold, white Bible gripped hard in his fists. His wife stood apart from him, back near the jail, clutching a basket of bread she'd brought every morning and never explained why. The sheriff paced near the hanging post, eyes shifting like he wanted to be anywhere else. He wasn't a bad man, just small, caught in the current of something stronger than his convictions. He glanced toward the cell once, then away. The noose creaked again. The wind moved through town like it remembered everything. And inside the cell, Jean stood. No one told her it was time, but she felt it. She smoothed her skirt, the same faded blue one she'd worn on the day they captured her, and braided her hair quickly, fingers trembling only once. She looked toward the window. The light was pearl gray now, soft as morning lace. She turned when the deputy came. He didn't meet her eyes, just unlocked the cell and stepped back. She walked out with her head high, boots quiet on the floor. A hush fell over the crowd as she was led through the doors. One by one, heads turned, eyes narrowed or dropped. Even the loud ones went still. Someone whispered, "That's her." The girl who slit a man's throat in his own parlor. The girl who wore no veil of shame. The girl who didn't cry. The girl who was to die. Jean climbed the scaffold without help. She didn't stumble. The boards groaned beneath her, but she stood straight. The rope hung like a question above her head. The preacher stepped forward, voice tight. Last words. She said nothing. The sheriff cleared his throat, nodded to the hangman, who stepped forward with shaking hands. That's when they heard it. The sound rolled in slow, like thunder with a heartbeat. A single set of hooves on hard ground. Not the rushed clatter of a posse or the wagons of curious strangers, but something older, steadier. The kind of sound the earth made room for. Heads turned toward the eastern road. The wind quieted. A horse emerged from the white, black as midnight sin, taller than any they'd seen in years. And atop it, a man, broad-shouldered, long coat dragging, hat low. Dust from states away clung to him like smoke. He didn't ride fast. He didn't have to. People moved for him like water. Silas Crane. The name passed between lips like an old prayer or a fresh curse. Some had heard he died at Fort Donner. Others swore he rode with outlaws before turning bounty man. No one could name his mother. No one dared ask where he'd been. But they knew what it meant when he came. The horse stopped 10 paces from a gallows. Silas didn't dismount. He looked up. Jean didn't blink. For a long breath, nothing moved. Then, low and quiet and full of the dust of 10 hard winters, he said the words that broke the spell. "That woman is my bride." A ripple moved through the crowd like a tremor. The sheriff stepped forward, confused, mouth parting. Silas dismounted with slow ease, boots thudding softly in the snow-packed dirt. He reached into his coat and pulled out a paper, folded but crisp. Marriage license, stamped with the town's own seal. The sheriff took it, read it twice, hands shaking harder than the wind. "Jean May Dawson," he read aloud, voice flat. His eyes met hers, then flicked to Silas. This was filed 3 months ago. Wasn't no one's business till now, Silas said. His voice wasn't loud, but it filled the square. She was to be my wife. Now she is. A silence followed, strange and long. The preacher stepped back. The crowd leaned forward like one body. But she's my wife, Silas repeated calm. And you got no law says you can hang a man's bride without a trial. Not after the papers are filed. Not unless you're the judge, the jury, and the Lord himself. The sheriff looked toward the crowd, toward the noose, then at Jean. She hadn't moved. Her face was unreadable, but her hands had stopped shaking. Someone in the crowd muttered, "Ain't right." Another added, "Law's the law." The sheriff took a deep breath. He looked up at Jean again, then down at the license. He tore the hanging order from his breast pocket and shoved it into his coat. "Cut her down," he said. The hangman hesitated. "I said cut her down." The rope dropped. The crowd gasped, then backed away like the wind had changed. Jean stepped down without help. Her boots touched ground. Her legs didn't buckle. Silas offered no arm. She didn't ask for one. They walked side by side through the crowd that had come to watch her die. Not one dared speak. The wind picked up again, and somewhere between her first step and his last glance back at the gallows, something shifted. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But something like it. And though neither of them said a word, the way she turned toward him, the way he let her lead him home, told the town everything it didn't understand. That not every bride walks in white, and not every gallows gets its weight. Silas Crane had always been more rumor than man. Before he rode into Mercy Creek that morning, his name was something folks spat in saloons or whispered between fence posts when the sky turned gunmetal. He wasn't spoken of with warmth or contempt, but with wary awe, like a lightning strike remembered long after the storm passed. They said he'd once stared down 4 bounty hunters in Kansas without lifting his pistol. They said he'd buried his own brother for betraying a code no one else could name. They said he never stayed anywhere longer than it took to bury the dead or collect his due. What no one said, because no one knew, was that Silas carried a slip of paper in the inside pocket of his coat, pressed between oilskin and a bullet crease. He kept it dry through downpours and desert heat. It bore a woman's name, written in clerical ink, Jean May Dawson. It bore his name, too, scrawled in a steadier hand than folks believed he had. Dated, signed, legal. But Silas hadn't spoken her name in months. Not aloud, not even to himself. When the noose dropped and the town split open around them, he didn't speak to Jean either. He merely walked beside her down the main street, past the gawking townsfolk in shuttered windows, toward the edge of Mercy Creek where the cottonwoods bent with snow and silence. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't ask anything. He led her to a small cabin, unpainted and weather-bitten, half covered in drifts. The place had stood empty since the widow Hargraves passed. He'd paid coin to the sheriff that morning to have it cleared and warmed. Inside, a stove smoked low, and 2 chairs faced each other like old adversaries. He opened the door for her. She hesitated for the first time since the scaffold. "I'm not afraid," she murmured, voice dry as cracked bark. He didn't answer, just stepped aside. She walked in. The door shut behind them, and the town lost sight of both. By noon, Mercy Creek had turned into a hive of questions. The saloon was loud with outrage and drink, boots thudding on floorboards like verdicts. Miss Templeton, who ran the general store, claimed she knew Jean from way back and that she never was right in the head. Mr. Jenkins, the undertaker, said Silas had once buried a man standing up just to make a point. Everyone had an opinion, and no one had answers. Except the sheriff, who sat in his office staring at the marriage license, wondering how 2 ghosts could forge a document that real. The preacher's wife knocked softly on the cabin door near sundown. She carried soup and 2 biscuits in a cotton-wrapped bundle, eyes darting to and from the street like a secret could be caught in daylight. When Jean opened the door, she hesitated. Silas wasn't in sight. The woman said, pressing the bundle forward. "You've no reason to trust me, but bread's bread." Jean took it gently. "Thank you." A long pause stretched between them, cold air weaving through the doorframe. "Is it true?" the woman asked. "You too?" Jean looked down at the bread in her hands. She didn't lie, but she didn't explain either. He came for me, she said simply, and closed the door. Silas returned at dusk, snow dusting his shoulders, face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He walked in without fanfare, removed his coat, and hung it on the nail near the stove. She sat by the fire, one hand around the locket that had been tucked beneath her collar, even on the gallows. She hadn't opened it since the morning he gave it to her, months before all this began. He dropped 2 rabbits on the counter and began dressing them in silence. After a long minute, she asked, "Why did you come back?" He didn't look at her. "Seemed the right time," he said. She studied his face. The beard was trimmed now, the scar near his temple faint in firelight. He looked older than when he left. Or maybe grief did that to a man. "I didn't expect you to," she said. He nodded once. "I know. You could have let them hang me." He laid the knife down. Met her eyes. "I know," he said again. "Didn't want to. That was all." Their history wasn't made of fireworks or confessions. It had bloomed in hushed moments. Weeks ago, he'd stumbled through her door, gut shot and near delirious. She'd taken him in because it was storming, because no man should die alone in the rain, because something in his eyes said, "I don't expect kindness, but I won't forget it either." He stayed 4 nights. On the 5th morning, he was gone. But before he left, he'd asked her name. She'd given it, and he'd written it down. Back in town, the law cracked under strain. The dead man's kin had arrived that evening. 3 cousins and a lawyer with a city hat and righteous fire in his voice. They stomped into the sheriff's office demanding justice, threatening judges, speaking of reputations and legal oversights. "She murdered him," the eldest cousin growled. "We won't sleep till she hangs." The sheriff handed them the paper. "Let them read the signature twice." "Married," he said simply. "A sham. Arranged to stop the hanging." It was filed before she was arrested. The lawyer turned red. "Then we'll take it to the circuit judge. He'll order a retrial." The sheriff leaned back, tired. "Maybe," he said. "But if Silas Crane is standing between that girl and your rope, you best bring more than a paper." That night, Jean and Silas sat across from each other with rabbit stew cooling between them. The snow whispered outside like old secrets. "I don't know what to do now," she said. "You're not dead," he answered. "Start there." She laughed once. Small, honest. He didn't smile, but something in his face softened. They didn't touch, didn't reach, but something settled in the space between them. Not safety, not yet, but possibility. Before they rose for bed, he reached into his coat and pulled out the license again. Set on the table between them. "I'm in it when I signed it," he said. "Don't care if you did or didn't." She stared at it, then at him. "I never asked you to save me." "You didn't. So why?" Silas studied her for a long moment, as if the answer had weight. "Because I knew what they'd say about you," he said. And none of it was true. The locket in her hand warmed with her grip. Silas stood, moved toward the door. "I'll sleep on the porch," he said. And he did, wrapped in his coat, rifle across his knees, watching the town as if it still had claws. Inside, Jean lay staring at the ceiling long after the fire died low, one thought circling her mind like a hawk. He came back, and for the first time in days, her heartbeat no longer sounded like a countdown. The days passed slow, like thawed drips from an icicle, steady but quiet, and Jean did not speak of the man she killed. Silas never asked. He chopped wood in the mornings and fed the fire before she could rise. When she woke, coffee was already brewed, and a tin cup sat beside the hearth, steam curling like the breath of a soft ghost. They didn't share many words, but they shared silence well. That perhaps was rarer. The townsfolk still stared when she ventured out. Miss Templeton refused to meet her eyes in the mercantile, but the little boy who'd watched her near the gallows now left her folded drawings near the cabin steps, crooked flowers and sky-colored birds with too many wings. Once, Jean found a stick figure sketch with her holding hands with someone tall, shadowed in charcoal. She didn't ask who the boy meant. She tucked it into the locket Silas had given her. She hadn't yet opened it. The preacher's wife came by on the 3rd afternoon with a parcel of stitched cloth and a tin of lemon balm. She didn't stay, didn't ask questions, just placed it on the porch with a soft, "Lord sees hearts, not records," and vanished before Jean opened the door. Jean carried the cloth inside, smoothed it over the table. It was blue, the same color as the dress she'd worn to be hanged. That evening, Silas returned late, his coat dusted with trail snow. He nodded once, took off his hat, and said, "Found the mare." She wandered past North Ridge. He didn't mention the 3 men he'd passed who refused to meet his gaze. Didn't say they carried rope or rumor. He just added more wood to the fire, as if the heat could keep out more than cold. Jean stirred stew over the stove. She said, without looking at him, "It wasn't my husband." Silas didn't flinch. He just sat, waited. "He bought me." The ladle paused. Her voice stayed flat, but her hands were clenched at her sides. "Not in a saloon, not in a brothel. Bought me with real coin, like a man might buy a mule. Told my father I'd be well fed. Said he needed a quiet girl. I was 17. She set the ladle down. The steam rose between them, thick and spiced. He locked me in the back of his house. Windows were nailed shut. I learned to be silent. I learned to shrink. He'd bring me out for guests when he wanted to play the doting husband, then send me back behind the curtain." Silas didn't move. She looked at him then, really looked. Her eyes weren't full of tears, but the edges were wet, like frost before it melts. "When he got mean, I knew to keep still. But that last time, I dropped a plate. Just a plate. He hit me, harder than usual. I hit back. She drew a breath, held it, then let it go. Not with fury, just to stop him. Just once. He fell in a fire poker. I think he was dead before he hit the floor." Silas nodded slowly, as if cataloging the story rather than judging it. "I ran," she said. "Didn't think. Didn't plan. Just found my way out the kitchen window and kept walking. Didn't stop till the trees turned yellow." There was a silence then, not between them but around them, the kind that stretches like skin over something deep. Jean picked up the ladle again, stirred the stew without needing to see. Silas said, "And when they came for you?" "They didn't ask much. Just saw the man on the floor, blood on my dress. Called him a respected landowner. Said I seduced him, then stabbed him in rage." She laughed once, bitter and short. "Rage," she repeated. "I barely had breath left for rage." He looked at her with that same steady gaze he'd worn on the gallows. "That they didn't listen," she finished. "No one does, unless you're bleeding in front of them." The fire popped softly like it, too, exhaled something. Silas reached into his coat, drew out a flask, untouched, and placed it on the table. Then he unpinned a small bundle of wax paper. Inside, 2 molasses biscuits from the bakery across town. She stared. "You think sugar's gonna fix that?" she asked, half a smile in her voice, brittle as dried leaves. "No," he said, "but it helps." She took one, broke it. The smell flooded the cabin, warm, sweet, familiar. She hadn't tasted molasses since her mother's kitchen. When she bit in, her breath caught. "I was ready to die," she said quiet. "On that scaffold. Wasn't scared." "I know," he said. "But when I saw you ride in," she stopped, chewing slow. "I wasn't sure if it was a dream or a trick, but something in me unclenched." Silas stared into the fire. "I told myself if you were dead, it meant I was done. But if you ever came back, I'd come back," he said, simply. She reached for the locket at her neck, fingers pausing. "Is there a picture in this?" she asked. He nodded. She opened it slowly. Inside, a faded photograph of a woman with soft eyes and Jean's chin. The edges curled, the ink faded, but familiar. "My mother," she whispered. "No," Silas said. "Mine." She looked up. "She had eyes like yours," he said. "Kind ones, but they never helped her." Jean closed the locket gently. No tears, only a deep inhale, as if her lungs had been locked for years and just now remembered their purpose. The stew simmered. The fire cracked low. "Will they come back for me?" she asked. "Maybe," he said, "but not tonight." She didn't ask how he knew. Instead, she stood, walked to the window, and opened it just a sliver. Cold air swept in. It smelled of pine, smoke, and stars. Behind her, Silas rose, pulled an extra blanket from the chair, and laid it over the bed. He didn't offer comfort, only presence. She turned, leaned against the window frame. "I used to dream of disappearing," she said. "Now I just want to be seen. Whole, ugly, kind whatever's left of me." He didn't answer with words. He stepped toward her, paused just within arm's reach. Then, slow and reverent, he reached for her hand. She let him take it, and for the first time in years, her shoulders dropped. The firelight danced across the cabin walls. Outside, the wind shifted. The snow had stopped falling. The trees stood quiet, listening. And though the world still bore her name like a curse, in that room, Jean was no longer a prisoner of silence. She was a woman who had spoken and been heard. It started with the sound of boots, 7 pairs, heavy and sure, crossing the main street just before dawn. No shouting, no lanterns raised. Just men moving like law and death belonged to them. The sheriff stood at the window of his office, watching them come, his breath fogging the glass. He'd known this was coming. The paper pushers from the county seat had been sniffing around for days, whispering about justice and public pressure. But it wasn't the judge they'd sent. It was the dead man's blood kin with money and rifles, and a lawyer who wore polished boots like a badge. The leader, a cousin named Whitaker, didn't knock. He just opened the door and walked in like he'd already won. "This ain't gonna hold," he said. "That outlaw of yours forged a piece of paper and walked a murderess free." The sheriff didn't move from behind his desk. "It's a legal marriage." "Not to us. That don't make it less true." Whitaker leaned over the desk. He smelled of whiskey and privilege. "She killed our kin. Ain't a single soul in this town that doesn't know it. You keep hiding behind forms, Sheriff, but justice doesn't need a signature." The sheriff met his gaze, slow and tired. "If you're here to file for retrial," he said, "there's a judge riding in tomorrow. You can make your case then." Whitaker smiled thinly. "And if we don't want to wait for that?" The room went quiet. Behind the door, a deputy fingered the rifle across his lap. He was young, but not green, and his eyes stayed on the floor. The sheriff didn't glance at him. "You bring trouble to that cabin," the sheriff said, "and you won't leave with it." Whitaker turned to go. "Then we'll see what trouble listens to," he said. Jean knew the moment something shifted, not by shouts or fire, but by the silence that followed. The kind that swells in a town when people choose to look away from something they know is wrong. She stood by the woodpile, splitting kindling with practiced rhythm, when the preacher's wife arrived again. No basket this time, just her hands wrapped tight around her coat sleeves. "They're planning something," she said. "They're calling it a retrial, but it won't be law. It'll be blood." Jean didn't flinch. "Silas?" she asked. "Went to town," the woman said. "Alone." Silas stood in the saloon, not at the bar, but in the center of the room, where men felt watched and out of place. He spoke low, steady. Told the story no one wanted to hear. The one about a girl sold in plain sight, locked in a house with walls thicker than any jail. He didn't beg for understanding. He just let the truth fill the air like smoke. He wasn't a saint, Silas said, voice flat. And she wasn't a killer. But you all stood still when she was dragged in like a rabid dog. Not one of you asked why her hands were shaking or why she hadn't cried. The room was quiet. Even the barkeep paused in his glass polishing. "They said she slit his throat in a jealous rage," Silas continued. "But the truth's simpler and colder. She was surviving, and you all would have hung her just the same." A man near the back stood up. Old rancher. Worn face. "She still killed him," he muttered. "She lived," Silas said. "He didn't. You decide what that says." And with that, he walked out. By sundown, Mercy Creek was split in two. Half the town stayed inside, shutters drawn, pretending it was just another cold night. The other half lit torches. They didn't call a mob, but the firelight betrayed them. Whitaker stood among them, rifle on his shoulder, the lawyer just behind him, lips pressed in grim satisfaction. They moved like a slow wave toward the edge of town. The sheriff caught up to them near the creek bed. "You step 1 foot toward that porch," he said, "and you're not coming back with a clean conscience." "We're not asking your permission," Whitaker said. "Good," the sheriff answered, "because I'm not giving it." He turned his horse across the path. Behind him, 5 men followed. Miners, shopkeepers, one schoolteacher with his sleeves rolled. They weren't armed, but they stood, and the mob stopped moving. At the cabin, Jean was already outside, coat buttoned, hands tucked into her sleeves. Her hair was tied back, but a few strands fluttered like nervous thoughts. She stood just below the porch, boots rooted in the snow. She wasn't hiding. Silas stepped out beside her, rifle slung but untouched. "You don't need to do this," she said. not looking at him. "I'm not doing it for me," he replied. A flicker of something moved behind her eyes. In the distance, the torches stalled. Jean walked up the porch steps and stood before the door. Slowly, she opened it, stepped inside, and returned carrying a small, folded quilt. She held it out to Silas. "My mother made it before I was born," she said. "It's the only thing I took when I ran." He took it, held it like a flag folded after a war. She turned to the road, faced the firelight. "If they come," she said, "don't shoot first." "I won't," he said, and they waited. The torches reached the hill, then slowed. Whitaker barked something about justice, about cowardice, about taking back what was stolen. But the words didn't land like they had in town. Out here, in the hush between trees and open sky, they sounded small. From behind the line of firelight, another voice rose, soft but firm. "The preacher's wife. No man with a God in his chest lays a hand on that girl," she said. A murmur rippled through the torchbearers. Then another sound, small footsteps. The little boy from town. He held something in his hands, moving carefully past the men with torches. He walked straight to Jean and held up a new drawing. A woman and a man, holding hands. A cabin. A son. She took it with trembling fingers. "Is that you?" she asked. He nodded. She smiled, small and real, and placed the drawing on the porch rail, held by a stone. The mob didn't know what to do with that. One man turned back, then another. Soon, it was just Whitaker and two others, standing in the snow with nothing to burn. The sheriff said nothing, just turned his horse and followed the boy back toward town. Silas watched the men go. When they disappeared into the night, Jean leaned against the porch post, closing her eyes. Not in relief. Not yet, but something softer. "They'll try again," she said. "Let them," he said. She opened her eyes, looked up at the stars. They seemed farther away tonight, but they were still there, and she was still breathing. For now, that was enough. The sky cracked open on the sixth morning, not with lightning, but with color, bruised rose, tarnished gold, the kind of dawn that feels like it's bleeding. Snow glittered crusted on the fields, hard as glass. Mercy Creek stirred with wary breath. No torches this time, no shouting, just that charged silence before a storm fully breaks. Jean woke before the sun. She dressed slowly, fingers steady now, each button fastened like an oath. The dress was plain, brown woolen, patched at the sleeve. She had worn it while sweeping the floor of a house she'd once been locked inside. Today, she wore by choice. In the other room, Silas was already at the stove, coffee warming, his hands wrapping the kettle in a rag like he meant to keep it from shivering. He looked up as she stepped in. Didn't say anything, just poured a cup and slid it toward her. She took it, sat at the table. They shared the silence like it was holy. Then he said, "Judge comes at noon." She nodded. "You don't have to speak." "I will." He didn't argue. Instead, he pulled something from the shelf, her locket, set down days before, unopened since. He placed it on the table. "You left it." She looked at it, small and warm in the light, and whispered, "Not by accident." Silas tilted his head. "I wanted you to know I wasn't carrying ghosts anymore," she said. "That when I speak today, it won't be for the dead." He stared at her, not with question, not with admiration, but with that steady gravity he carried like weather. "Then let's see what the living will do." By the time they reached the courthouse, the benches were full, not from curiosity, but from reckoning. Folks who'd watched her led to the gallows now had to sit with their part in the story. The judge was a lean man with sharp knuckles and a worn black coat. He looked like someone who'd buried more truth than he'd spoken. When Jean stood to speak, his eyes narrowed, but he didn't interrupt. She told them everything, not with fire, not with tears, but with the even voice of someone who had nothing left to lose. She spoke of the cabin with shuttered windows, of the bruises behind sleeves, of the final day when she raised her hand not to destroy, but to defend. When she finished, no one moved. The judge tapped a pen on the desk, looked at her, then at Silas. "You filed the marriage license 3 months ago," he said. Silas nodded. "Why?" "You had no legal reason to." "No need." Silas stood. His boots echoed in the wood. "I didn't need a reason," he said, "but I had one." He looked at Jean. "She saved me." A ripple moved through the room. The judge leaned forward. How so? Silas spoke like a man reading from the inside of himself. I was dying. Not from blood loss, that healed, but from not belonging to anything. She fed me when I had nothing. Gave me a bed, her silence, her trust. And she didn't ask for a name. He paused. I left, because I didn't know how to stay. But I signed that license because I knew if I didn't claim her, the world would forget she had worth. The judge stared at him a long moment, then leaned back. I'll render a verdict at dusk, he said. Jean stepped down, walked past the benches where half the town sat not with pride, but with shame carved into their posture. A few lowered their eyes. A few tried to meet hers, but she moved past them like rain over stone. Outside, the air was sharp. A wind had picked up, chasing drifts like ghosts across the road. She stood by the rail, fingers curled around the edge, breath fogging in front of her. Silas stood beside her. I'm not afraid, she said. I know, but I don't want to be caged again. You won't be. He said it like he meant it. Like the promise could bind time itself. They waited. The snow turned slushy underfoot. The courthouse bell tolled 3 times. Then 4. Then 5. At dusk, the judge emerged. Coat collar pulled high. Papers in hand. He didn't address the crowd. Just handed the decision to the sheriff. The sheriff read it silently. Nodded. Then stepped forward. She's free, he said. No one cheered. No one clapped. The kind of justice that arrives late does not invite celebration. The preacher's wife wept softly. The boy with the drawing smiled like the sun, just peeked out. Jean didn't cry. She just turned to Silas. And for the first time since he'd come back, she reached for his hand. He didn't flinch. She laced her fingers through his like it was always meant. As they walked through town, people stepped aside. Some with guilt, some with wonder, but none with scorn. By the time they reached the cabin, night had fully fallen. The stove was still warm from the morning. She set her shawl on the hook and looked around like seeing it anew. He poured 2 cups of coffee, handed one to her. She looked up at him, eyes clear. I'm not broken, she said. I never thought you were. I don't know how to be loved. Then we'll start with liking, he said soft. And rest. And firewood. And bread. She smiled. And for the first time in years, it didn't feel borrowed. Outside, snow began to fall again. Not heavy, just light enough to make the world quiet. In the hush, Jean whispered, You came for me. Silas looked at her, steady as the hills. No, he said. I came home. And in the cabin's warmth, the storm finally passed.